Leaders and delegates from nearly 200 countries are attending the United Nations Climate Conference, also known as COP30, in Belém, Brazil. On Friday, talks continued on critical areas like the future of fossil fuels and finance. We begin with Paulo Cabral. He joins us now from Belém. Paulo, good to see you. What's the latest on the talks? What are some of these stumbling blocks and what can we expect?
Well, Anand, as you were saying, the big thing is actually the issue of dependence on fossil fuels and then how to finance a progress to get to a lesser dependence on fossil fuels. This was Brazil's proposal from the beginning, the creation of a roadmap in that sense. And there was some optimism at the beginning of this week when the agenda was approved quite quickly. But then as the days progressed, there was not much advancement in that sense. And that comes above all because of resistance from countries that are heavily reliant on oil production. And Saudi Arabia has been kind of a leader of this group. These countries, many of them do have problems with that, but Saudi Arabia kind of took the lead to oppose this proposal of Brazil. And then in the end, the Brazilian presidency arrived on this very last day with a draft that did not include the roadmap to independence on fossil fuels. Then there were many complaints, well, of civil society very much, NGOs, activists, environmentalists, but also of many nations, particularly the European Union. Colombia, President Gustavo Petro is very vocal about the need to end dependence on fossil fuels, and also of the small island nations, particularly from the Pacific, that are very much concerned for their future in the short term. Now, negotiations are still happening. Actually, I was just outside. There's a huge crowd in front of the rooms waiting for the president of COP, André Correia do Lago, a Brazilian diplomat, to come out and say if they have anything new, or even if COP could continue until tomorrow. This is one possibility. It would not be the first time that this would happen. Whenever negotiators feel that they are maybe close to something, they may decide to extend negotiations for another 24 or even maybe 48 hours to see if they could reach some conclusion. So this is where we're standing now, waiting for COP presidency to come out of negotiating room and say at what point they are, and if it's worth talking 4 hours more, or if this will be then for COP31 that we already know is going to happen in Turkey with the presidents of Australia. Along that way, there will be also a pre-COP discussion on the situation of small island nations. And also Colombia is promoting in 2026 a meeting in their country to discuss the phasing out of fossil fuels. But again, everything still to be defined here. What kind of climate, what kind of leads will be given from Belém? Well, that's still to come, hopefully in the next couple of hours or so.
Thanks, Paulo. That's CGTN's Paulo Cabral reporting there from COP30 in Brazil. Well, later in the show, we will hear how climate change is impacting Malaysia and the government's response there. But time now for our panel. With us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He is a senior fellow at the Center for International Government Innovation, and he's chairman of Asian Narratives on Substack. Also with us from New York is Michael K. Dorsey. He is chair and director of Sustainability Solutions Service and professor with the College of Global Futures at Arizona State University. And with us from Belém, Brazil is Barbara Rosen Jacobson. She is a senior climate advocacy advisor at Mercy Corps. Welcome to all of you. Barbara, let me start with you. As we just heard, countries are sharply divided on cutting back on fossil fuels. What, in your view, are the main stumbling blocks? Could they be overcome? Could there be a late deal?
Yes, well, this is very important because we need a good deal. We need an ambitious outcome this COP. So these issues will have to be overcome. And earlier in this process, as was already rightly mentioned, there seemed to be a growing momentum for the movement away from fossil fuels and a concrete roadmap for this. And we really need this to survive. And at the same time, this issue is really inevitably related to the issue of finance. For many countries, developing countries, especially those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, who are struggling to make this transition away from fossil fuels, resources are just missing to implement this and to protect their populations to the impacts of climate change that are already happening on the ground. So an ambitious outcome for us needs to include both an ambitious outcome on fossil fuels, but also on climate finance, and in particular on adaptation finance, which is also on the table and which is also a very important issue at this COP.
Right. I want to get into the finance issue a little later in the show in more detail. But for now, let me go to Einar Tangen in Beijing. Einar, what are your thoughts on what's taking place at COP30 right now? As we heard, there are divisions. The opposition to a fossil fuel deal is being led, as our reporter told us, by Saudi Arabia. Do you see a compromise in the making here?
Probably don't. I mean, what you see here are different perspectives in terms of necessity. I mean, the oil nations feel that the economy is going down. The price of oil is below what they believe they need to operate their countries, especially Saudi Arabia. And then you have this issue about metrics. Originally, this was going to be, you know, the one implementation. COP30 would, you know, create a uniform set of metrics so that you could start dealing with how you, you know, can finance these types of things. But it's just, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. You know, China has been playing a very important role, but with the absence of the United States, very difficult. You need unanimity across the world to deal with a global problem. And right now, the United States has taken a duck. Donald Trump, as he said, thinks that climate change is a hoax. And in that kind of backdrop, with the economies kind of failing downwards, it's very hard for these countries to make the sacrifices necessary. But you have other countries who see this as an existential threat to their existence. It's very, very difficult to see how this is going to come together.
Right, but Einar, you know, China has made considerable progress in cutting back on fossil fuels. I mean, could the Chinese offer the world the template, perhaps offer that template to the rest of the world and how they did it?
Well, China's been leading by example. Actually, this year they had a negative emissions outputs. Part might be due to you know, decreased amounts of production in certain areas, but overall, you know, their exports are up. So at this point, yes, China provides a template. It's not only a template; they're providing the technology that would allow it. For instance, in Oceania, 1/4 of their GDP is devoted to importing oils, especially diesel, which are used to run generators. China has the solutions for these microgrids on little islands where they can power their cars, their boats, their homes, even their communications. This would allow them to be very much independent to increase it, but it doesn't address the overall bigger elephant in the room, which is the bigger producers. China's one of them, but it's, as I said, leading by example, whereas the U.S. has just walked away.
Michael Dorsey, as Einar pointed out, there's one big empty seat at the conference table. That one belongs to the United States. The Trump administration is staying away from COP30. How significant is the U.S. absence?
You know, there's an empty seat of politicians in Berlin. The U.S. is not there from the government side, but the reality is that on the money side, those that are financing the solution set, renewable energy in particular, they're surging ahead. The politicians, whether they be from Riyadh or Washington, D.C. or other points in between, are squarely behind the lump of coal, as we might say, or underneath the barrel of oil. But investments, however, are up. We're almost going to be, at the end of this year, north of $2 trillion invested in renewable energy. That's up over 100% just on the solar side over the past decade. We're looking at closing in on almost $1 trillion, about $750 billion in solar alone. We're up in investments in China, certainly. China represents investments in about 1/3 of the planet's investments, more than the U.S. and the EU combined. So even the Saudi money from their sovereign wealth fund, the Public Investment Fund, they've put in about $40 billion in renewables alone. So the politicians are behind that lump of coal, not present, not sending the right signals to the market. But if we follow the money, we see that the big money is moving towards renewables, and that's really an unstoppable train. Even the president's son-in-law has about $1/3 billion invested in renewables, money that he got from Saudi investors. So the money is taking the right course on this. The politicians are, as they often have been, behind that lump of coal, unfortunately.
Barbara, the climate crisis continues to be called an existential threat. Do you sense that there is an urgency among delegates at COP30 to come up with workable solutions, at a time when we're hearing very often that the world is lagging behind on meeting those heating targets that were talked about at the Paris talks, and that was 10 years ago. And at a time like this, how important is it for these countries to come together? How important is the entire idea of cooperation and multilateralism?
It is crucial. It is crucial, and we don't have an alternative. This is the place where all countries in the world can come together, and we have seen all countries except for the US do that this year. They have all shown up, every single one, because of this is an urgent issue, and many of these countries are already facing the impacts of climate change. They are facing devastating droughts and floods. They are facing extreme weather events, and they need to protect their populations against this existential crisis, as you rightly called it. We are seeing that developing countries are jointly calling for the provision of at least $120 billion a year in adaptation finance, so finance that protects these populations against climate impacts from developed countries to developing countries. And this is what the climate crisis demands. Right now, the cost of the climate crisis are borne by those who have least contributed to it, those on the front lines of climate impacts whose crops are being destroyed by droughts and who have nowhere to go in heat waves. They don't have air-conditioned homes, and they are the ones currently paying, literally and figuratively, for the climate crisis. This is not just, this is not fair. This needs to be addressed through, indeed, mitigation, a transition away from fossil fuel, but also by providing finance for adaptation and to address the losses and damages that result from climate impacts. And this urgency is real. I believe that many delegates who are here in this building do feel this urgency, and this needs to be reflected in the outcome.
Einar, of course, we live in a multipolar world right now, and China has been a champion of the whole idea of multilateralism, of the world working together to solve its problems. How important is that approach in trying to come to some agreement at this conference?
Well, I mean, China's reflecting the reality. We have an existing multipolar world, and the question is how you work together. It has to be through consensus. As I said, and I'll keep repeating, that China is leading by example, not only in terms of technology, in terms of investment. I would caution slightly this idea that money is pouring into renewables. It's not all for the right reason. A lot of that is being poured in simply because the existing grids and even developed countries like the US are not capable of handling the electricity demands of these huge server farms that are related to AI. So what we need is a long-term financing of significant projects that reduce that, but that has to be coming together globally. The problem is with the United States creating uncertainty, especially in the business environment. It's very, very hard for countries to take that extra step that is necessary to make that commitment. Everybody feels the urgency, but there are two kinds. One is the existential, will we survive this? And the other is, how do we do this economically?
Michael Dorsey, let's talk about financing in a bit more detail. Financing is always a major issue at these conferences. It's something that you are very familiar with. At the bottom line, developing countries need more help from developed countries. As Barbara pointed out, it's the countries that did not contribute to the crisis we find ourselves in right now that are bearing the cost of what that crisis is. What is your assessment of where funding is right now?
Look, there is a problem in the multilateral landscape. We've got still sustained commitments from the multilateral banking system, from the World Bank, from IMF, etc., continuing to prop up fossil foolishness. And that needs to end. They need to get out of that business. They've been told this, year on year, now coming into a few decades. That structuring and getting out of that and building a kind of a downward escalator, that hasn't happened. That needs to happen. And at the same time, we need to ramp up and make accessible more funding and more subsidies for renewable energy. I would challenge Einar. I wouldn't say that the renewable energy financing is going after bad or being deployed for bad reasons. I think really That train, that multi-trillion-dollar train, left the station many years ago, actually. We're now coming to the second year of north of $2 trillion invested in renewables. And that includes not just generation assets, but certainly distribution and line and storage and efficiency improvements as well. So those activities are going to happen. We need more policy coherence. We don't need this stochasticity that we see from different administrations around the world, whether they be in Riyadh or DC or Beijing or what have you. That needs to end. That may not end, but the money here is pushing forward in the face of this kind of, call it policy stochasticity.
Einar, it's just not finance, is it? I mean, are developed countries making a bigger effort in the transition to green energy?
Well, they're trying, but they lack finance. So I disagree that the money is going to where it is. It's going to where it can make a profit, but that is not necessarily the basis of the problems with climate change. So right now, there has to be an alternative way. From my perspective, the only way that can happen is if these countries who have resources start banding together, creating their own OPECs for spices, coffee, iron ore, etc., and reversing the wealth flow that has been going westward for so many years. If they are able to do that, they can then deal with the climate change issues themselves instead of having to show up to COP30 and beg everybody else for that. That approach, in my opinion, is not working. It's time to move on.
Okay.
It's time to give them their own agency.
Barbara, very quickly, I've only got about 20 seconds. What are your thoughts on finance?
We need more finance, we need better finance, we need finance for mitigation, as was discussed here, for renewables, for the transition, but also for adaptation and supporting countries. This finance needs to come from those who have profited the most from the fossil fuels and who have the best capacity to pay. So we need more and better finance, and it needs to be part of this outcome, along with a strong outcome on transitioning away from fossil fuels.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thank you to all of you for being with us. We turn next to Malaysia. What impact is the climate change crisis having there, and how is the country responding? I talked earlier with Nazmi, Ahmad. He's a member of parliament and a former Minister of Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability for Malaysia. Nazmi, Ahmad, thanks so much for joining us. Now, climate change is having a significant impact on Malaysia. We've seen flooding as well as sea levels rising. How would you describe the threat that climate change poses to Malaysia?
It is a very big threat. As you mentioned, we see flooding, the intensity is increasing, sea level rise. We have beaches that are disappearing on the east coast of the peninsula. We are having temperature rises in the cities due to the urban heat effect. So yeah, we are experiencing climate change in a very drastic manner.
Now, how is Malaysia responding? What are some of the strategies that the government is using?
On one hand, I think we've been quite ambitious. Malaysia is a small country. We have historically been a small contributor to emissions. But at the same time, we realized that we need to show our commitment to fulfill the Paris Agreement and also to build a more climate resilient Malaysia. So the country is in the midst of passing a climate change bill that is skewed more towards mitigation measures, and it has an ambitious net zero goal to be achieved by 2050. At the same time, the country is also working on a national adaptation plan in order to adapt to climate change. And the other part as well is that Malaysia is trying to harness our natural, the nature, our biodiversity as part of the strategy to fight climate change as a major carbon sink. So these are the things that the country is doing, but it has its challenges as pockets of the country are still in poverty, and the country is still reliant on fossil fuels as an engine of growth for the economy, as well as subsidies that have been enjoyed by the public for so long.
Right, and what can you tell us about these adaptation strategies, these mitigation measures that you are taking that will be in this bill?
So currently, our electricity generation in Malaysia is about 80% from fossil fuels, predominantly coal and natural gas. The idea is that by 2050, at least 70% of it will come from renewables, predominantly solar, battery storage, hydroelectricity, and also part of the regional ASEAN power grid, and possibly nuclear as well. So that will be a big contributor towards our transition. The government has started retargeting subsidies rather than blanket subsidies, focusing it on the what do you call that, on the poor and the middle classes. However, on petrol, the government has only implemented limited reforms due to fear of political backlash. In terms of adaptation, I think the one of the concerns is how do we preserve our nature. The country has since the Rio summit way back in 1992 committed to preserving 50% of its land surface as either forest or tree cover. And this is something that there has been, although deforestation is still a problem in Malaysia, but the UN has recognized that the country has drastically reduced deforestation. So these are among the measures that the country is taking in fighting climate change.
Now, you wrote an opinion piece in Al Jazeera recently in which you said that it's time that developed countries, industrialized countries, do more to help developing countries. Here in the United States, as you are aware, President Trump doesn't recognize climate change as a threat. In fact, he has called it a hoax. But how can the rest of the world, especially the developing world, take on this task of fighting climate change in a multilateral way?
This is not the first time that the US is out of a climate change agreement. The US was not part of the Kyoto Protocol before. And during Trump's first tenure as president, he also left the Paris Agreement. So, it is unfortunate because the US is the biggest economy in the world. It has historically contributed a lot in terms of carbon emissions. And we do hope that the US can play its part. But at the end of the day, this is the nature of democracy. And this, we have to, I think what Professor Stiglitz have been saying is this G-1 approach. I.e. with US being outside the room, sometimes it can be easier to get things done. And I think, the EU, China, and the rest of the world, including ASEAN, which Malaysia is a part of, we need to focus on that. And rather than just giving up or lowering our expectation, we just have to find ways because the world is in crisis and action must be now. So I think these it's how we have to deal with it. And we do hope that the EU, but also Japan, and also the oil and gas countries, they should do more in order to help the developing world to face the climate crisis, because only through climate justice can we bring everyone together in this battle.
Well, let's talk about ASEAN. This is something that you focused on. It's a powerful group of nations that works, with consensus. How can ASEAN lead the way in fighting climate change?
Yeah, just like it's just like what do you call that, UNFCCC, right? I.e., where the COP is, the whole COP discussion is also by consensus, which has its pros and its cons, right? It's very difficult to get an agreement, but the moment you get something, then you have a very workable framework because everyone has committed to it. So, ASEAN has its challenges, no doubt. It came out from the Cold War. It was a very different institution, but we also recognize the IPCC has recognized that ASEAN, Southeast Asia is one of the most susceptible regions to climate change. And ASEAN, it has almost 700 million people. It's going to be the fourth biggest economy in the world. It also has a lot of natural, resources and all that. So these are things that we need to harness for us to face climate change, because ASEAN is essentially a lot of it, it's islands, it's peninsulas, a lot of what do you call that, shoreline. So this we really need to face climate change in order for us to have a future for the region. So I think this is where ASEAN needs to ramp up. Malaysia was chairman of ASEAN for this year until November. So next will be Philippines, also a country that is very much ravaged by climate change. So there is a lot of expectation that ASEAN can do so. And recently, ASEAN passed a declaration on environmental rights that I believe is pointing in the right direction.
Now, China is a global leader in green technology, in the manufacture of green technology, the use of green technology, and of course the export of green technology. We look at things like solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles as well. How important is China's role, particularly in helping developing countries fight climate change?
Well, first and foremost, I think, from a country like Malaysia, or most developing countries, I think a lot of us want to be, we are quite agnostic. Malaysia has a history of trading with the entire world, with the West, with China, and we have grown historically due to that openness. And if we look specifically, in order for us to face the challenges of climate change, it is our ability or this choice of using the cheapest but also the best and the most effective technologies available, because largely we do not create these technologies. This is our strategy to face climate change, and I think that's one of the major criticisms that we have when the West, especially the US, were taking much more restrictive approach with regards to China. On the products, whether it's EVs, whether it's solar panels and whatnot, because we really want to have the best and also the cheapest product available. And the West also pursued similar strategies in the past. So we believe that, and China, I think it has a good track record in this sense. It's not, we are not entirely uncritical, but we believe we've seen how China has cleaned up its air, the air pollution that we saw in the Beijing Olympics. A lot of it has been overcome. We have seen how the acceleration of clean tech and clean energy, how it has dominated China in a big way. So these are lessons that we want to learn and also want to emulate in our own country. And again, it's not about China, it's not about the US. Any country that can provide us with the best and the cheapest tech, we would be happy to adopt it.
Okay, so we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.